I'm not a magician. Those were the words of India national football team boss Igor Stimac after his team lost 1-0 against Syria in January 2024. Only development, coaches, investment, structured competitions, and long-term plans will take us forward, Stimac went on to state. On the face of it, it seems like a reasonable point. The head coach of any national football team can only work with the players they're given. The hard work, in many respects, is years in the making, takes place in the shadows, at grassroots level, and is orchestrated by people who rarely receive any credit. The fact that India, one of the world's earliest adopters of football, owing to Britain's colonial rule, with the world's fifth largest economy and now the largest population, of more than 1.4 billion people, would require an act of divine intervention or the wielding of some kind of supernatural powers in order to overcome Syria, a country which has just 1.5% of India's population and has been ravaged by a brutal civil war and one of the world's worst humanitarian crises for the last 13 years, ought to raise one or two questions in of itself though. You are probably familiar with a lot of the reasons behind India's lack of success within international football. Hockey is India's national sport, while cricket is by far the nation's most popular pastime, and the country lacks the adequate infrastructure, suitable youth facilities, or even subpar coaching required to compete on the international stage. India's decision not to attend the 1950 World Cup due to the travel costs, and prioritising football at the Olympics instead, and their victory at the 1983 Cricket World Cup, led to a lot of those long-term ramifications, as I covered in a previous video, but you can neither explain nor attribute the entirety of India's lack of success in football to a missed opportunity 74 years ago and a triumph in another sport 41 years ago. No, I'm afraid that it goes a little bit deeper than that. Where there's money, there's corruption, and there is an awful lot of money in football. Those of you with even a fleeting interest in this channel, or football in general, will most likely be familiar with the deep-rooted corruption within several national football associations, whether that be Tunisia, Tajikistan, Bulgaria, Romania, or France, along with the confederations themselves, CONCACAF, CONMEBOL, CAF, the AFC and UEFA, and of course, the head of the snake, FIFA, the organisation which governs world football, whilst also serving as a how-to handbook to gangsters, mob bosses, and tin pot dictators worldwide. When it comes to serving up a lethal cocktail of corruption and incompetence, sacrificing a nation's footballing dreams and aspirations for the sake of some third-rate politician or administrator making a quick buck, few can rival the All India Football Federation though. It's often said that there's a lack of interest in football in India, where the sport plays second or third fiddle overall, and a lack of talent. And whilst there are grains of truth to both of those claims, football is immensely popular in parts of India, like Goa, Kerala, and West Bengal, which together have a population far larger than England, Germany, or France, and all three produce plenty of talent. That talent is just horribly mismanaged, if not overlooked entirely, for a myriad of non-football reasons ranging from outright corruption to bizarre mysticism. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to India, as we take a look at one of the worst-run football federations on the planet, perhaps the most underachieving national team, and without doubt one of the most let-down football nations, in what might just be one of the wildest videos that I've ever made. Between 1937 and 2022, the All India Football Federation only had 10 presidents. The first two presidents were British Army officers before India gained its independence. Moin-ul-Haq was the man in charge when India withdrew from the 1950 World Cup. Pankaj Gupta served as the AIFF's president for 10 years, despite literally being nicknamed Mr. Hockey. Manindra Nath Dutta Ray, who was best known as a first-class cricket umpire, occupied the role for 15 years, many of which were blighted by captaincy disputes. Nur al-Amin got the job for 5 years after guiding India to gold as head coach at the Asian Games. Khalifa Zuddin, the so-called Iron Man of Indian football, ruled with an iron fist for 8 whole years, followed by Priya Ranjan Dasmunsi, an Indian National Congress politician who held the presidency for some 20 years. In 2008, however, Dasmunsi suffered a massive stroke. The stroke left Dasmuntsi in a minimally conscious state, and after 9 years in a coma, he died. Following Dasmuntsi's stroke, he was replaced by another politician, Praful Patel. Patel is a member of parliament who sits in the Rajya Sabha, India's upper house, and he is associated with the Nationalist Congress Party, which broke away from Dasmuntsi's party, the Indian National Congress, during the late 1990s. Patel, even by his own account, had very little prior experience working in football, nor did he appear to be a particularly big football fan or have any great knowledge of the sport. If you're thinking that makes Patel an unusual choice to head the All India Football Federation, which, governs Indian football, then fear not, you're not going mad, but this is hardly a new development. And believe me, we're only just getting started. Speaking to the Indian Express in 2020, Patel stated, quote, "I had nothing to do with Indian football. I was only a vice president and happy to do my thing in Maharashtra. It was only when Mr. Dasmuntsi got unwell that I got in. Otherwise, I was not coming into Indian football." End quote. For someone who wasn't that interested in football, Patel sure did climb the greasy pole of football administration with plenty of skill and finesse. Patel became the president of the AIFF in 2009, remaining in the role, virtually unopposed, for the next 13 years. The veteran politician, who was once India's Minister of Heavy Industries and Public Enterprises, even exceeded the maximum 3-term limit that is supposed to be imposed upon AIFF presidents. But why let silly little things like rules get in the way of a good grift? In 2015, Patel also became the Asian Football Confederation's vice president of the South Asian Football Federation, or SAF region, at an AFC Congress in Bahrain. In 2016, he was appointed senior vice president of the Asian Football Confederation, and in 2017, he became a member of the FIFA Finance Committee. It would be fair to describe Patel's 13-year reign as AIFF president as having been eventful. Under his leadership, India's men's national team reached an all-time low world ranking of 173rd before bouncing back into the top 100. Lots of youth and academy development projects were proposed, but few were ever delivered. Controversial commercial partnerships were struck, the Indian Super League was launched, bringing big-name foreign players like Nicolas Anelka, Alessandro Del Piero and Roberto Carlos to India, and the AIFF was persistently blighted by allegations of corruption. To give just one such example, in 2014, AIFF official Alberto Calarco was banned for 3 years by FIFA for taking a bribe. Look, I know, we will just have to skip over the irony of FIFA finding anyone else for taking bribes for now, but rest assured, we will return to the topic of FIFA hypocrisy within the context of AIFF mismanagement and their complicity in just a moment. FIFA's Ethics Committee found that Calarco, who was formerly the General Secretary of the AIFF, had accepted a bribe in return for voting for Qatari incumbent candidate Mohammed bin Hammam in the 2009 AFC presidential election. The election campaign between bin Hammam and his rival, Sheikh Salman bin Ibrahim Al Khalifa, who is a member of Bahrain's ruling House of Khalifa, was a particularly closely, and indeed bitterly fought one. During the heated campaign trail, which involved a war of words on both sides, FIFA's honorary vice president at the time, Chung Mong-jun, who was also the president of the Korea Football Association, accused bin Hammam of being both mentally ill and a criminal. Prior to that, bin Hammam had accused Chung of bankrolling Sheikh Salman's bid to become president and threatened to cut his head off. No, I didn't stutter there, and you didn't imagine it. The incumbent AFC president threatened to decapitate the vice president of FIFA. May I remind you, these are the people who run the most popular sport on earth. Bin Hammam claimed that his comments in Arabic had been misunderstood, and that he intended only to metaphorically cut Chung's head off. So, that's a relief, I suppose, likening what he really meant to say to the English expression heads will roll. Bin Hammam won the election by 23 votes to 21, with 2 spoilt ballots, so Calarco's vote, found to have been bought by the FIFA Ethics Committee, was hugely significant. In light of that, a 3-year ban might appear rather lenient, and it is, but there is good reason for that. Kalarko was hardly alone among the 46 delegates who voted in the 2009 AFC presidential election in having been corrupted. Both sides, bin Hammam and Sheikh Salman, were accused of widespread corruption and vote buying during a few years where journalists briefly cared about football being riddled with corruption. Bin Hammam was later banned for life by FIFA's Ethics Committee for financial wrongdoing, while Sheikh Salman became AFC president in 2013 and is now the senior vice president of the all-powerful FIFA Council. According to Human Rights Watch and the Bahrain Institute for Rights and Democracy, Sheikh Salman headed a committee tasked with identifying Bahraini footballers and other athletes who had participated in the 2011 Bahraini uprising, which took place within the broader Arab Spring. Many of those identified by the committee are reported to have been imprisoned and tortured. Having initially refused to comment on whether he was responsible for the political persecution of athletes, Sheikh Salman later denied the accusations, calling them, quote, false nasty lies. This is the man who is the president of the Asian Football Confederation, the body which governs football in the largest and most populous continent on the planet. Back to India specifically though, Alberto Calarco's 3-year ban was not a one-off. In fact, if anything, it was pretty much the norm. In 2018, Indian football was rocked by perhaps its most significant corruption scandal yet. Former Indian Super League player Godwin Franco, who once went on trial with German outfit Fortuna Dusseldorf and had left India by 2018 to play in Costa Rica, published a series of tweets exposing corruption within the Indian game. Franco shared what he claimed were screenshots of an email exchange that he'd had with the Football Players Association of India, or FPAI, which is the union that is responsible for representing footballers in India. In the exchanges, Franco wrote that, quote, certain agents along with certain people at clubs have been and are signing players into clubs with bad performances, poor form, lack of fitness, and those who don't have the abilities of a footballer that are required to play professionally ahead of more genuinely deserving football players is totally unacceptable. I see so much of this. End quote. To which Franco's screenshots suggest the FPAI had responded to him stating, quote, if you claim there are agents who can get players in, why do you not use these same agents? End quote. An indignant Franco responded angrily to the suggestion that he should use the same unrighteous methods of getting into clubs, as he put it, as others, and swore never to play football in India again. Following 15 years playing professional football in India, during which time he won the Indian Super League, the I-League, and the Indian Super Cup, Franco, who was already 33, stayed true to his word. Each of those individual cases belied a much deeper, darker, and more damaging underbelly to Indian football though. Everyone is broadly in agreement when it comes to the problems that are holding Indian football back. Fragmented internal associations, too few games, too few opportunities, woeful infrastructure, facilities and coaching, and a chronic lack of resources. The disagreements stem from A, how best to address those problems, and, even more importantly, B, whether the people in charge have any genuine interest in fixing those problems to begin with. Throughout Praful Patel's 13 years in charge of Indian football, the AIFF was always at pains to point out that he was rarely involved in day-to-day decision-making. That might sound like a dereliction of duty on the part of the body's president, but given Patel's already mentioned inexperience and lack of expertise in football, that was actually sold as a benefit. Patel was a delegator, therefore, ultimately responsible for the way in which the AIFF was run and decisions made at the top, but more than happy to allow each individual department to take care of their own internal affairs with little to no interruption. One of Patel's big initiatives when he entered office, though, was to open a number of football academies administered by the AIFF around India, focused on improving the access of talented young players to elite coaching and facilities at an early age, thus improving their development and giving them a fighting chance of becoming capable and competing with their international peers. It made perfect sense, and several of these academies started to spring up in India's footballing hotspots and largest metropolitan areas. Pretty soon the AIFF discovered, seemingly to their surprise, that running football academies wasn't cheap, and before the project had even had time to bear any fruit, most of them were shut down to cut costs. At the same time, wholesale reform of grassroots football in India was drawn up by Rob Barn in an effort to improve accessibility to youth team football, talent identification, and the integration between different clubs, leagues, and associations. Barn was hired as a technical director by the AIFF in 2011, having previously served in the same role for Feyenoord, the Netherlands youth teams, and Australia, following 5 years of experience as an assistant coach with the Netherlands senior team many years before that. He spent 3 years contracted to the AIFF, advising them on how best to improve the fortunes of Indian football, starting at the grassroots level. But once again, owing largely to costs, his transformative recommendations never came to fruition. Instead, Patel and the AIFF chose to go down a slightly different route. Instead of putting money that was so desperately needed into youth development, grassroots football, and greater integration, India would attempt to lure capital to the nation's football through hosting international competitions and creating a glitzy new league. And the money would eventually, naturally, as it always does, trickle down to things like youth development and the grassroots game. That was the plan, supposedly. Since 2011, India has hosted no fewer than 30 different international football tournaments, including the FIFA Under-17 World Cup, the South Asian Football Federation Championship, 3 times, and of course, the Intercontinental Cup, which was won by North Korea in 2019. That's an average of more than 2 tournaments a year over a period of 13 years. Likewise, in 2013, the AIFF played a pivotal role in the creation of the Indian Super League. The creation of the new league owed itself in large part to one of Patel's first moves as AIFF president, and arguably still the most significant, which was a $155 million partnership with IMG Reliance, a joint venture between Reliance Industries and IMG Worldwide. It was a deal which divided opinion within India. On the one hand, it brought a lot of money into the AIFF at a time when they desperately needed it, given the ambitious academy and grassroots projects they were still promising at the time, but on the other hand, the sheer length of the deal, which granted IMG Reliance exclusive rights to Indian football for the next 15 years, raised eyebrows, and there were concerns about the threats that the deal might pose to the integrity of the Indian game. Indian football is simultaneously very old and very young. Because India was a British colony, the so-called jewel in the crown of the British Empire, football arrived and was popularised in what was then the British Raj much earlier than it did almost anywhere else in the world. The Durand Cup, founded in 1888 and still competed to this very day, is the 5th oldest competition in world football and the oldest outside of Britain and Ireland. Calcutta FC, who began playing football in the 1870s, were perhaps the first association football club outside of Europe, and certainly the first in Asia. Having a nationwide league, and particularly professional football by contrast, is very new to Indian football. The National Football League, or NFL, founded in 1996, just 28 years ago, was India's first nationwide league, and it wouldn't be until 2007, only 17 years ago, with the creation of the I-League, that India finally got a nationwide professional football league. To put that in some perspective, England has had a professional nationwide league since 1888, the United States got its first professional league in 1921 and has had one permanently since 1996, and even China, despite coming to codified association football much later than India, has had a nationwide professional top flight since 1994. The I-League had only been going for a mere 6 years when the AIFF, in conjunction with IMG Reliance and Star Sports, launched the ISL. The new league was intended to bring money into Indian football, and so it did. A number of franchises were acquired by major corporations or consortiums which included famous cricketers, Bollywood stars, and business people. A number of big-name players and coaches were subsequently brought to India, which was almost without precedent. Atletico de Kolkata, for example, who were co-owned by Indian cricket legend Sourav Ganguly and the La Liga side Atletico Madrid, hence the name, made former Liverpool and Atletico Madrid winger Luis Garcia the first ever marquee player in the ISL, FC Goa, owned by Indian billionaire Venugopal Dutt and his partners, appointed Brazilian legend Zico and signed Robert Pires. Meanwhile, Kerala Blasters, who were co-owned by the greatest Indian cricketer of them all, Sachin Tendulkar, made former England number 1 David James their player-coach in the league's inaugural season. There was lots of excitement and anticipation, even if all of the league's marquee players had turned 30 before India even had a professional top flight, and attendances were extremely impressive for a startup league. The ISL was loosely based on Major League Soccer in the United States, but the average attendance in the ISL's first season was higher than the MLS had ever and still has ever averaged. Overall, the league averaged 24,711 fans in its debut campaign, rising to 27,111 in 2015. Atletico de Kolkata drew a crowd of in excess of 60,000 for a home game against Mumbai City. Meanwhile, Kerala Blasters averaged over 50,000 at their home games in the 2016 season. So, mission accomplished then. Patel and the AIFF were right. Money has flooded into Indian football, providing the financing for world-class youth coaching and facilities, and India is well and truly on the way to becoming a powerhouse in the international game. Well, not quite. You see, the ISL's attendances were impressive, but it's important to put them in some context. Though the average attendance in the ISL may have been higher than in Major League Soccer or even Serie A, the total attendance in the league was just 1.6 million compared to 6 million in Major League Soccer in 2014 and more than 10 million in 2022. That's because the Indian Super League season was, and in some ways still is, incredibly short. In 2014, the league was timed so as not to overlap with the I-League and spanned just 2 months and only 61 matches. There will be over 100 matches at every FIFA World Cup from 2026 onwards. A Premier League season, for comparison, lasts over 7 months and involves some 380 matches. What's more, as the novelty of the new league wore off, hampered by unpopular off-field decisions, a poor standard of football, scheduling conflicts, and ineffective marketing, attendances fell at an alarming rate. The pandemic didn't help, of course, forcing 2 seasons to be played behind closed doors, but even in the 2 seasons preceding COVID, average attendances had already more than halved from over 27,000 at their peak in 2015 to barely 13,000 in the 2018-19 and 2019-20 seasons. There has also been persistent unpopular moves by clubs, validating the concern surrounding commercialization that many fans expressed back in 2010. Mohun Bagan from Kolkata, for instance, who are one of India's oldest, biggest, and most historically significant clubs, having become the first all-Indian club to overcome British opposition to win a championship when they beat the East Yorkshire Regiment in the 1911 IFA Shield final, leading to a surge in national pride in India's push for independence, were acquired by KG SPL in 2020, the same group that previously owned Atletico de Kolkata, or ATK, as they later became known. When KG SPL bought Mohun Bagan, they disbanded ATK, with Mohun Bagan taking their ISL license, and they renamed and rebranded Mohun Bagan as ATK Mohun Bagan. This is a club that was founded in the 1880s and played a significant role not just in the history of Indian football, but India's modern history as a whole. Fans, unsurprisingly then, didn't take too kindly to having the ATK branding tagged onto their name, and they weren't shy in letting their feelings be known. In 2023, following 3 years of persistent protests by supporters, KG SPL dropped the ATK from the club's name. They are still officially called Mohun Bagan Super Giants, but everyone still calls them Mohun Bagan regardless. The promise of riches, therefore, even if some very wealthy people now own or are involved with Indian football clubs, hasn't filtered down to the academy or grassroots level where it is so desperately required. What's more, instead of serving to unite the fragmented Indian game, the ISL only created more divisions. I mean, including quite literally, of course. The Indian Super League's creation alongside the I-League meant that India had two separate but competing leagues vying for supremacy and recognition as India's top flight, both recognised by the AIFF, but only one of them emphatically endorsed, and the other recognised by FIFA and the AFC as India's top flight, but the ISL meanwhile only as a cup competition, meaning that, for the first 2 seasons at least, its teams weren't allowed to compete in AFC or FIFA competitions. Now the ISL is officially recognised as being India's top flight, and the I-League as the second tier, but it was a thoroughly messy process that brought us to this point, indicative of a woefully mismanaged football environment. The kindest read of Patel's 13 years in charge of the AIFF was that he had a strategy which he tried but that ultimately failed, and for all the shine of an already declining new league, and plenty of international tournaments having been hosted, next to nothing has been done to address the fundamental problems afflicting Indian football. The less generous read, which is not without its advocates, is that there are far fewer opportunities for administrators and those close to them to make a quick buck when managing and maintaining regional academies, or building football pitches for example, than there is when hosting major tournaments, and all that comes with it, or striking lucrative partnerships with corporations to create a new league. Corruption, as you well know by this stage, hardly being a novel accusation to be thrown at the AIFF. Indian football is hideously corrupt, make no mistake, but I would hate for any of you to underestimate the extent to which it is also just mind-bogglingly incompetent. Perhaps the most notable, and among the most recent example, of the sheer insanity that is the AIFF, Indian football, and the India national team, is the scandal surrounding the involvement of a highly paid astrologer in selection decisions. No, you didn't black out there or accidentally click on another video. I said the involvement of a highly paid astrologer in selection decisions. India may have a weak player pool, for reasons that ought to be obvious by this stage, but it is nonetheless still the case that the 11 best Indian footballers don't necessarily start for India. Now, you may think that's the case for all national teams, so just to be clear, I'm not talking about Ibrahima Konate starting for France ahead of William Saliba, which you may well disagree with, or Gareth Southgate starting Marcus Rashford ahead of Phil Foden. Those are tactical decisions all coaches have to make, which will inevitably divide opinion. No, what I'm talking about, in regard to India, is players literally not being selected on talent or merit, rather than mere differences of opinion. In 2022, an astrologer by the name of Bhupesh Sharma, whose Facebook cover photo shows him wearing a hoodie which says, "I can see more than you can see," was recommended to the India national team's head coach, Igor Stimac, by a top AIFF official. Not as a player, thankfully, though that would hardly be any more ridiculous, but effectively as a consultant, offering his views on team selection, substitutes, predictions, and a whole lot more. For any of you who might not know, astrology involves making claims about human affairs based upon the apparent position of celestial objects. It has been widely discredited and recognised as pseudoscience for the last 200 years, but that doesn't stop newspapers from continuing to publish horoscopes, or the All India Football Federation from thinking, "I can see more than you can see hoodie man" might be better at picking a football starting 11 and squad than the man who they hired as their head coach based upon his managerial experience in football. Perhaps the most extraordinary part of this story isn't that Sharma was recommended to Stimac by a top AIFF official, that should be about par for the course at this stage, but that Stimac went along with it. Sharma, an astrologer, I'll remind you, was even consulted on injury and fitness updates, and internal text messages between Sharma and Stimac would appear to show that his astrological interventions were frequently heeded and treated as authoritative. The only conclusion is that Stimac, who won 53 caps for Croatia, played for West Ham and Derby County, and previously managed Croatia's national team, is either stark raving mad and a great fit therefore within the AIFF, or he was being so heavily lent on by someone at the AIFF that he felt that pointing out the madness going on all around him would likely get him sacked. Speaking to the press, he stated, quote, "Bhupesh was recommended to me, and I was convinced by others that I had to check up on his possible effects in sports." End quote. Either way, whether crazy or just spineless, Stimats is still in charge of the India national team. AIFF President Praful Patel said that he wasn't aware and hadn't been told about Sharma's involvement with the national team, but former AIFF Secretary General Kushal Das defended his involvement, stating, quote, "I was worried about whether India would qualify for the Asian Cup, and so was Igor. Let me be very honest. For me, the most important thing was that India should qualify." End quote. There is good reason why Das would defend the move, namely that he was the AIFF official who put Sharma in touch with Stimats. Sharma was reportedly paid as much as $18,000 for his 2 months consulting with the national team, during which time he offered such invaluable advice as, quote, "not recommended for the day," and "might get over-aggressive." Given the fact that this reportedly wasn't even the first time that the India team consulted an astrologer, the only people who ought to be getting over-aggressive are surely Indian football fans at their absolute farce of a federation. Believe me, neither the farce nor the tragedy ends there. In 2022, India also hosted the AFC Women's Asian Cup, but following a breach of the COVID regulations, which saw 12 of their players test positive, the India national women's team had to pull out of their own tournament on home soil. India's women's team are stronger than the men's, ranked 65th in the world, but they are even more chronically and shamefully neglected. The India Women's League, or IWL, which was recently expanded, is still only 3 months long, and an entire campaign consists of just 36 matches. Each of the league's 7 teams play just 12 games. How on earth are India's women footballers supposed to develop in those circumstances? There have also been darker allegations surrounding India's women's teams. Women's under-17s assistant head coach Alex Ambrose, pictured here when he was Nicholas Anelka's assistant coach at Mumbai City, was sacked for sexual misconduct in July 2022. The incident first came to light during a so-called exposure tour in Norway, another one of Patel's bright ideas which involves spending lots of money to send a tiny number of young players abroad rather than nurturing a load of them at home, where Ambrose was allegedly caught in an inappropriate situation with a member of the underage side. Ambrose, age 41, was recalled to India immediately and later dismissed, and criminal proceedings against him have since begun. He denies all wrongdoing. Remarkably, Sudeva Delhi FC, a team in the 3rd tier of Indian football, still tried to appoint Ambrose in May 2023 before apparently changing their minds. Whoever would have thought that there might be some backlash for trying to appoint a man currently facing criminal proceedings relating to the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act. Elsewhere, India have been reprimanded on multiple occasions for fielding overage players in youth team competitions. Unlike in most cases of age fraud, it's not that the AIFF or anyone else typically has been unaware of a player's real age, or even denied that they are overage. They have literally just included players who they know and admit are too old to compete in competitions in their squad, so it is tough to know whether to chalk that one down as corruption, gross incompetence, or both. It's both, isn't it? It's always both. India further don't help themselves by not allowing dual citizenship at a federal level, which isn't that unusual. Countries like China and Japan do likewise, but India also doesn't allow PIOs, persons of Indian origin, or OCIs, overseas citizens of India, to represent the national team. It means that several players who could have played for India, under FIFA rules, who both wanted to represent India and would undoubtedly have raised the standard of the national team, have been prohibited from doing so by the AIFF. The likes of Blackburn Rovers winger Dylan Markande, veteran Norwich City centre-back Danny Bath, and Ross County's Jan Danda would be able to represent India if the rules were changed, as has long been posited, though still nothing has happened, and all three would walk straight into the current India team. After exceeding the maximum 3-term limit as president of the AIFF, Praful Patel was removed from the presidency in May 2022 when India's Supreme Court disbanded the AIFF and placed a 3-member committee in charge of temporarily governing the sport. Due to FIFA's rules around government overreach and interference with football federations, the move by the Supreme Court saw India suspended by FIFA. The 2022 FIFA Under-17 Women's World Cup, due to be hosted in a couple of months' time, was stripped from India, and Indian teams, both men's and women's, club and international, were prohibited from competing in international competitions. Of course, FIFA sat idly by while the AIFF was ravaged by corruption, because it was corruption that they could count on. Indeed, Praful Patel still sits on FIFA's Finance Committee 2 years after he was removed by India's Supreme Court. But the threat of government interference, or more to the point, the threat of a massive federation coming under the control of people less amenable to the current FIFA regime, well, now that is unconscionable. None of that is to say that the Indian government's intentions when it comes to the AIFF are benevolent, or even that Patel's ousting will lead to a cleaner or more competent AIFF. Just that, in case you hadn't got this from any of my previous videos, FIFA are terrible. In September 2022, Kalyan Chaubey, a former footballer turned BJP politician, that is the party of Narendra Modi that governs India, was elected as the new AIFF president, defeating one of India's greatest and most decorated players of the modern era, Baichung Bhutia, by 33 votes to 1. That is despite every Indian that I've spoken to having been unwavering in their support for a Bhutia presidency rather than a Chaubey one. India was only suspended by FIFA for 11 days, being reinstated as 2022 FIFA Under-17 Women's World Cup hosts, but Chaubey has, yes, you guessed it, already been accused of corruption. Ousted legal advisor Nilanjan Batterjee, in a letter to Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has alleged that Kalyan Chaubey was part of a non-transparent tender process and made attempts to siphon off money from the federation for personal expenses. The Asian Football Confederation have asked Batterjee to support his claims and are conducting a probe based upon the evidence provided. Chaubey has denied the allegations, describing them as baseless, and accusing Batterjee of attempting to damage his reputation. Baichung Bhutia, who won 84 caps for India and played under Neil Warnock at Bury, has called for Chaubey's resignation. The end result is, well, a mess, in which Indian football, which is laced with potential, continues to lie in the doldrums, the sport is marred by scandal and corruption, and none of the underlying issues, which everyone agrees upon, are any closer to being meaningfully resolved. It is infuriating as an onlooker, so one can only imagine what it must be like for those who genuinely care about the game in India. India is the fastest growing market for the distribution of Premier League football, which is indicative of India's passion for football and is great news for the Premier League, given India's growing economy and the size of the population. But it's not quite so good news for the already declining Indian Super League, or most likely for Indian football as a whole. FIFA almost certainly has one, if not two eyes on India and China when it comes to the clumsy recent World Cup expansion, given their economies and the fact that they make up over a third of the world's population between them. But as things stand, even with 8 or possibly even 9 Asian teams via the intercontinental playoffs at the World Cup from now on, the likelihood of India qualifying anytime soon is slim. Speaking in 2022, Praful Patel stated, quote, "I am happy that at the world stage, first AFC and now FIFA, there is so much optimism outside India. Sometimes I feel sad, there is so much pessimism within India. They don't know anything, and they are optimistic. We know everything, and we are pessimistic." End quote. Patel's comments were meant to be an endorsement of Indian football and, presumably, by extension, the job that he had done. But they really reflect the opposite. From the outside looking in, India has a huge population, a growing interest in football, and an increased footprint primarily through hosting tournaments on the international stage. There appear to be causes for optimism. On the inside, however, among those much closer to the reality on the ground, Indian football is a cesspit of malfeasance and ineptitude, where youngsters lack basic access to football, talent is wasted, and the best players aren't even necessarily picked if an astrologer, who's paid more than 99% of Indian footballers themselves, doesn't like the sound of them. So yes, those who know everything, or at least enough, are pessimistic, and with very good reason. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it. Hit the like button if that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course, it goes without saying at this stage, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on, both for this channel, HITC Sevens, and also my second channel, Alfie Potsama, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of outstanding videos that you might fancy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, or Threads via the username at HITC Sevens on all three, should you wish to do so, and all of those links plus a whole lot more should be down in the video description below. Cheers.